On a warm June afternoon, golden sunlight spilled across the porch of a modest home in Ashland, Oregon. Eleanor Harper, 73, gently tended to the lavender bushes growing beside her weathered wooden fence. The soft scent of the blooms wrapped around her like a memory, offering a calm she had spent her whole life trying to reclaim. A distant metallic clang broke the silence, the mailbox bell. She wiped her hands on her apron and made her way slowly to the mailbox. Peeking from between the usual clutter of advertisements was an ivory-colored envelope. The handwriting on it was unmistakable, familiar in a way that made her hand tremble. Pacific Crest School of Music cordially invites alumna Eleanor Jenkins to the 50-year reunion class of 1973. She froze for a moment. The world seemed to still. A gentle breeze swept by, lifting the corner of the envelope in her hand. Her heart fluttered, not from age, but from the sudden rush of memories that the name Pacific Crest had summoned. She saw it all again, the old domed recital hall where she used to spend long afternoons practicing piano. The sunlit corridors where students laughed and mingled. Corridors she often walked alone, clutching a quiet, fragile dream of becoming a true artist. And then she remembered him, Professor James Winters. She was still Eleanor Jenkins then, 22 years old, nervous but hopeful, standing backstage after her graduation rehearsal. He had looked straight into her eyes and delivered the sentence that would break her spirit for decades. "You play music like you're reading a cookbook. Technically correct but soulless. Maybe consider another profession." Just one sentence, one moment. It shattered everything. Eleanor never returned. She withdrew from her final semester in silence. She changed her name after getting married, locked away her dreams, and disappeared from the world she once longed to be part of. 50 years passed. She built a life, as a wife, a mother, and later, a widow. Music became something she held quietly in her heart. Until 1 year ago, everything changed. On a whim, she auditioned for America's Spotlight, and when she performed, at last, the world watched in awe as a reclusive elderly woman poured her soul into a song. Her voice stirred a nation overnight. She became a sensation. Letters flooded in, performance requests, tears, apologies, some from classmates, a few from former teachers, but not from him, not from Professor Winters. Now, standing in her lavender garden, Eleanor held the embossed invitation in her weathered hands. It didn't say Eleanor Harper. It called her by the name she hadn't heard in decades, Eleanor Jenkins. That evening, as twilight settled, she sat at the dinner table across from her daughter, Lily, who read the invitation aloud, her brow furrowed. "What do you think?" she asked cautiously. Eleanor ladled more soup into her bowl, her expression unreadable. "It wasn't the school's fault," she said gently. "It was my decision to leave in silence." Lily looked down, then back at her mother. "But after everything they did, why go back now?" Eleanor met her daughter's eyes. There was no anger, just quiet resolve. "Because I don't want the final chapter of my life to be written by someone else." Lily nodded slowly. She understood. Her mother had never been loud, never bitter, but she had always been strong. "Then I'll go with you," Lily said softly. Eleanor smiled gently, her eyes filled with gratitude but certainty. "No need. This is a journey I need to take on my own." 3 weeks later, Eleanor stood at the wrought iron gates of Pacific Crest School of Music, the very place that once represented both the height of her dreams and the depth of her heartbreak. The school hadn't changed much. The same row of stately maple trees flanked the pathway, their leaves already turning a fiery red, even in early summer. The same bronze statue of composer Liszt stood in front of the main hall, polished by time and tradition. But she had changed. Older now, slower in step, but quieter in her heart, more whole, more herself. Inside the grand conference room where the reunion was being held, soft classical music drifted through the air. Pachelbel's Canon in D, played by a live string quartet. Crystal chandeliers glistened overhead, casting elegant reflections across white tablecloth-covered banquet tables. The room was alive with laughter and conversation. Former students, now silver-haired, some accompanied by spouses, others by grandchildren, embraced and shared stories, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. When Eleanor walked in, several heads turned. No one recognized her right away. Some paused mid-sentence. Others narrowed their eyes, brows furrowed. "Who is that?" Someone whispered. "She looks familiar." Leonard didn't acknowledge the stares. She quietly made her way to the back of the room, choosing a small table near the tall arched window. Sitting down, she folded her hands in her lap, eyes steady but distant. She wasn't here to be recognized. She wasn't here to be embraced. She was here to close a chapter that had never been written. Until now. The sunlight poured in through the window beside her, painting her face with soft golden strokes. Her hand rested lightly on a glass of water. The light, like a gentle companion, seemed to soothe the uncertainty within her. In the center of the room, the sounds of reunion carried on. Laughter, stories, the clinking of glasses. Faces once faded in Eleanor's memory now came into sharper focus. Susan Martin, once the prom queen, now with streaks of silver in her elegantly pinned hair. Peter Langley, the gifted, arrogant violinist who once scoffed at anyone less than perfect. And then, there he was, Professor James Winters. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. He was still alive. Tall, slender, his once dark hair now snow-white. His movements were slower, more deliberate. But his posture remained proud, his presence unmistakable. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes were still sharp. His voice soft, articulate, and unchanged. He stood surrounded by a circle of former students, speaking calmly, commanding the room just as he had decades ago. "Mom, he's aged a lot." Eleanor imagined Lily whispering beside her. But she was alone. And oddly, she didn't feel bitter. She didn't feel anger. Just a quiet tightness in her chest, like a breeze grazing an old scar. Suddenly, a woman in a red dress broke through the crowd and approached Eleanor's table. She stopped, studying her face with wide eyes. "Excuse me, are you?" Eleanor rose slowly, offering a warm, composed smile. "Eleanor Harper," she said, "formerly Eleanor Jenkins." The woman's eyes widened. She froze for a beat, then gasped. "Oh my gosh, it's you! I'm Denise. Denise Holloway. We took music theory together!" They laughed together, the sound light and genuine. "Your laugh still sounds the same," Eleanor said warmly. They embraced, not long, not dramatic, just a simple hug. But it was enough to remind Eleanor that she wasn't invisible anymore. "You performed on that TV show last year, didn't you?" Denise asked, her eyes gleaming with emotion. "I cried. So did my husband. We had no idea it was you." Eleanor smiled, a little shyly. "At the time, I didn't think anyone would recognize me. I haven't been a part of this place in a very long time." Denise reached out, gently taking her hand. But that voice never left. "They'll be sorry they didn't realize what they had." Just then, the soft crackle of the sound system interrupted the room's chatter. A young man's voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please turn your attention to the stage as we begin a short memorial honoring our fellow alumni who are no longer with us. Afterward, the floor will be open for anyone who wishes to share a memory, a reflection, or a piece of music." A respectful silence fell across the hall. The lights dimmed slightly as photos began to appear on the large projection screen. One by one, familiar faces faded in and out, smiling yearbook portraits from decades past. Eleanor's breath caught when she saw a name: Carol Matthews, her friend, her duet partner, gone since 2005. She had died of cancer. More names followed, more photos. Each image tugged at Eleanor's heart, pulling up the years she had folded away like worn sheet music. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't realized how many she had lost. When the final name faded from the screen, a quiet reverence lingered in the air. A moment later, the staff rolled a grand piano onto the center stage. Its polished black surface shimmered under the soft lighting. The host stepped forward again, offering a warm smile. "If anyone among us would like to share something, a few words, a memory, or even a song, please don't hesitate. This is a stage of memories and perhaps even a place to begin again." For a moment, the room stayed still. Then someone stood and told a light-hearted college story. Another alum read a short, heartfelt poem. But the piano remained untouched. Silent, waiting. Eleanor's gaze settled on it. Glossy still. A silent companion from a lifetime ago. "It's been a long time since I touched a piano," she whispered, mostly to herself. Denise turned toward her. "If anyone should step up there, it's you." Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because something had awakened within her. Not a desire to prove anything, not bitterness, not regret, just a longing to have one final conversation with the past, not in words, in music. She didn't know exactly when she stood up. Her body moved before her mind could resist. Perhaps the most courageous part of her had quietly taken the lead. As her low-heeled shoes met the first wooden step of the stage, a soft murmur swept through the auditorium. "Wait, is that Eleanor Jenkins? Didn't she drop out in her final year? I thought she disappeared." She heard it all. She responded to none of it. She hadn't come to be seen. She hadn't come to be applauded. She came to return, to give a voice back to the 22-year-old girl who had once walked away from her own dream in silence. Eleanor approached the grand piano. She paused for a moment and placed her hands gently on the lid, running her fingers across its cold ebony surface. It felt like an old friend. She slowly opened the lid. The faint scent of varnish, the soft clicks of ivory as she tested a few keys, and suddenly she was no longer 73. She was back in the spring of 1973. The same stage, the same piano, the same dream. She could almost hear the breath of the crowd as she played Claire de Lune during her final school recital. And she could almost see him afterward. Professor Winters, calling her into his office, pouring a lukewarm cup of tea, and saying in that flat, measured voice, "Eleanor, your music doesn't touch anyone." That voice, sharp, cold, final, still echoed vividly in Eleanor's memory. She had carried those words for decades like a silent bruise beneath the skin. But not anymore. Eleanor opened her eyes, adjusted the piano bench ever so slightly, and placed her hands gently on the keys. No introduction, no words, no preamble. She began to play. Not Claire de Lune, not Mozart, not even Chopin, but something else. A quiet, graceful piano arrangement of At Last, the very song that had brought her back to herself on America's spotlight. But this time there were no millions of television viewers. This time, she was playing for one person only, the young woman she used to be, the one who had silently left her final rehearsal all those years ago, heart in pieces, her dreams slipping through the cracks of a closed door. The first note rang out, soft and pure, drifting across the room like the first breeze of spring. Instantly, the room fell silent. The gentle murmur of voices stopped. The clinking of glassware halted. Even the string quartet paused, their bows frozen mid-air. Eleanor's music wasn't flashy. It wasn't filled with fast arpeggios or dramatic flourishes. It was simple. But it was honest. Her hands, those same hands once told they lacked feeling, now carried a lifetime of stories. They carried loss. They carried endurance. They carried a rebirth. And for the first time in 50 years, Eleanor wasn't performing. She was speaking in melody. No one remained an observer. Even Professor James Winters, seated near the center, turned fully toward the stage. His eyes locked on her unreadable. Was it surprise? Regret? Recognition? No one could say. As Eleanor reached the crescendo, her hands no longer trembled. On the contrary, they moved with grace and certainty, as if untouched by age, by memory, by judgment. She wasn't conquering, she wasn't proving, she was forgiving. The world, the past, and herself. She was telling a story. The story of a girl dismissed as soulless, of a woman who spent decades hearing music behind closed doors, of someone who had learned to let go. The final note rang out and hovered briefly in the air like the last ray of sun before dusk. Eleanor lifted her head. Silence, a breathless, sacred pause. Then applause. It started softly. From the left side of the room, a silver-haired woman stood, clapping slowly, nodding through tears. Then came the center row. Then the right. Soon the entire auditorium stood in ovation. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't frenzied. It was deep, resonant. The kind of applause that comes from people who know they've just witnessed something beyond explanation. Eleanor rose from the bench and gave a slight bow. She said nothing, and she didn't need to. As she stepped off the stage, Denise met her at the base, her eyes wet, her voice barely above a whisper. I've never seen anyone make a whole room go silent like that. Eleanor smiled faintly. I'm not even sure it really happened. Across the room, she noticed a tall, slender figure moving slowly toward her. Professor James Winters. She saw him coming, his steps deliberate but careful. Her heart slowed, not out of fear this time. She had carried his shadow for 50 years. But now, all she saw was an old man, standing in a room full of memories, just like her. He stopped a few feet from her. Eleanor, he said. His voice no longer carried authority. It carried hesitation, a kind of fragility, and then he added, almost whispering, thank you for not giving up on music forever. Those words, from him, fell into the space between them like a small stone dropped into still water, sending ripples across a lifetime. Eleanor stood silent, her gaze on his face. He had aged. So much. But his eyes were the same, searching. Humbled. There was nothing more to say, because the music had already spoken. The once sharp and stern features of Professor Winters had softened over time. His face, once rigid with authority, now seemed blurred, worn down by age and reflection. Actually, I did give it up, Eleanor said softly, her voice barely above a breath. For a very long time. James Winters nodded, his gaze fixed, unwavering. I know, and I'm afraid I was the reason. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Her mind wandered back, to the small apartment she lived in after walking away from music, to the elementary school where she taught reading and lullabies to children who didn't know she once dreamed of concert halls, To the nights she sang her daughter Lily to sleep, her voice the only place her music survived. Back then, she said slowly, a single sentence from you felt like a slammed door, and I wasn't strong enough to push it open again. James exhaled, deeply, as if releasing decades of guilt in a single breath. At the time, he said, eyes distant, I thought I was training real artists. I was taught that only strictness could push students past their limits. I forgot. He looked back at her. Not everyone needs to be thrown off a cliff to learn how to fly. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Maybe if you'd used a different approach, I still would have walked away, but not with a heart full of anger and doubt. He nodded, then asked, voice low but steady, can you forgive me? There was no pleading, just a sincere question from someone who finally understood what he had taken. Eleanor smiled, a gentle smile, softer than the sunlight pouring through the tall windows. I'm not angry anymore. Because if I hadn't left this place, I might never have had Lily. I might never have known the love of a good man. And I might never have realized that music can live quietly in the heart, waiting for the moment we're ready to hear it again. Professor Winters nodded again, his eyes now damp with tears. A warm silence settled between them. No more words were needed. When the event concluded, many came to speak with Eleanor. Some asked for photos. Others simply held her hand and whispered, thank you for that performance. Even Peter Langley, who once mocked her as plain Eleanor in orchestration class, approached, eyes lowered, offering a quiet apology. But just as Eleanor reached for the auditorium's door handle, a voice rang out behind her, Mrs. Harper, please wait. Eleanor turned, a young woman, maybe 20, rushed over. She had light brown curls, a hopeful expression, and eyes shining with admiration. I'm a junior in the composition program, she said breathlessly. I heard you tonight, and I don't know how to describe it. I've never heard an arrangement like that. It reached so deep inside me. Eleanor smiled, heart swelling. Thank you, dear. That arrangement didn't come from schooling. It came from life. The girl hesitated. If I invited you to come back and talk to us about music, emotion, how to write something that really lives, would you say yes? Eleanor looked at her, and for a moment she saw her younger self, the one who once believed that a piano and a dream were enough. She nodded. You know, she said warmly, sometimes it takes 50 years to return to the place you once walked away from. But if you come back with gratitude instead of bitterness, every door opens. Not just for you, but for those who come after. The young woman hugged Eleanor tightly, as if embracing the hope she had just found again. The following week, Eleanor returned to Pacific Crest, not as a forgotten alumna, but as an honored guest. In a small, sunlit concert room in the composition department, around 40 students gathered. Some held notebooks, others had violins or guitars across their laps. On the blackboard, written in large, careful chalk letters, meet composer Eleanor Harper. From the back corner, the girl from the week before, Amelia, smiled as Eleanor walked in. Eleanor wore a simple ivory blouse and a soft scarf, but now she walked with the quiet confidence of someone no longer burdened by regret. I thought you'd say no, Amelia whispered as she greeted her. So did I. Eleanor smiled. But sometimes we have to take a very long detour, just to come back to the place we were always meant to be. She sat beside the old upright piano. No grand stage, no judges, just open eyes and open hearts. You can call me Eleanor, she began, her voice calm and steady. I'm not here to teach technique. I'm here to tell you a story, one that took me 50 years to find the courage to share. And she told them. About a young girl with a dream, about a devastating critique, about years of silence, and the return of music when she least expected it. There were no cliches, no hollow advice, just a real woman speaking truth. Music doesn't need to be perfect, she said. It needs to be honest. If it doesn't make you feel something, it won't make anyone else feel anything either. A young man raised his hand. Then why didn't you give it up completely? Why keep it in your heart at all? Eleanor's gaze softened. Because some things, she said, when they truly belong to you, never die. Even if they're buried for years, they wait. They wait for you to be ready. That evening, on her way back to Ashland, Eleanor sat by the window of the train, watching the twilight pass. In her hand was a letter, handwritten, folded neatly, from Professor James Winters. Eleanor, thank you for coming that day. Thank you for playing a piece of music I could never measure with any academic metric, and yet can't stop remembering I'm still learning, even at nearly 90. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: never let a young person walk away before they've learned to believe in themselves. I hope you'll keep singing, teaching, as you did that night. Thank you for forgiving me. James. Eleanor folded the letter gently and placed it in her bag. She didn't need to hold on to apologies anymore. What she kept instead was the echo of applause from that night. Amelia's eyes. The feeling of standing on stage without fear. A few months later, a small recital was held at the Ashland Community Center. On stage, Eleanor Harper sat not alone, but surrounded by students of every age. An 8-year-old girl, trembling as she played her first piano piece. A 75-year-old man strumming his first chords on guitar. No lights, no cameras, no expectations, just music, real music. Eleanor sang once more, not for fame, not to prove anything, but simply because, for the first time in her life, she was no longer afraid to be heard. And so, Eleanor Harper's story came to a close. Not with dazzling lights or roaring applause, but with a deep stillness in the hearts of those who had once given up. Because this story isn't just about music. It's about second chances, about the courage to return to what once broke us, and about the quiet beauty of dreams that bloom without an audience. If you've ever given up because of one harsh word, believe this: it's never too late to begin again. Leave a comment if this story moved you. You never know. Your words may be the reason someone else decides to keep going. And if you believe that talent and resilience have no age limit, hit like and subscribe to help us share more stories like this one.